Hey, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tunde Olatunji. I'm the Associate Director of Policy here at the Africa Center. Thanks for joining us again. We're going to get started here in a second, but before we do, for those joining us for the first time, just a few words about the Africa Center. We're located here in Harlem, in New York City. We're a fairly multidisciplinary institution. We work primarily in the fields of arts and culture, policy, and business. And our primary preoccupation is narrative change around the continent of Africa. So we think it's important how the world comes to form its understanding of the place and its people and their contributions and its diaspora, and what kind of information gets to shape that understanding. And so as part of that work, we put on public programs such as this one. And sometimes that mandate is just a good excuse to talk about football on a Tuesday afternoon at work. And that is kind of what today is. And we are joined by our expert panel to help us break down the recent AFCON tournament and what it means for the state of African football. We have three panelists joining us today. Unfortunately, one of them had to drop off with technical issues, but I'm sure he'll join us back in a few minutes, but I will introduce him anyway in the intros. First of all, we are joined by Sean Jacobs, who is an author and an associate professor of international affairs at the Graduate School of International Affairs at the New School here in New York City. He's also the founder and editor at Africa as a Country, a site of opinion analysis and new writing on and from the African left. We're also joined by Maher Mezahi, who is a journalist based in Algiers, covering mostly football in North Africa. His work has been published in the BBC, The Guardian, The Telegraph, ESPN Africa, and Al Jazeera English. He also hosts the Africa Five-A-Side podcast in partnership with Africa as a Country. Look at that, worlds colliding, and we'd love to see it. And finally, Fiifi's not here yet, but he will join us. He's an award-winning Ghanaian writer, broadcaster, and author based in Accra. His work has been featured in many outlets, including the BBC, ESPN, SuperSport, The Daily Telegraph, Business Insider, Goal.com, Copa90, and FIFA.com. So Fiifi is very busy. Thank you all for being here. I imagine you're all very busy with your day job, so I appreciate you dropping in for this to talk to us. If you guys don't mind, we're just gonna get started and jump right into it. I want to start with you, Maher, if you don't mind. You were in Abidjan for the games, and just give me like a high level rating out of 10 of the experience, and then some explanation for that number.
Yeah, the African Cup of Nations is always really one of my highlights of my year. So for me, it rarely ever dips below a nine. But this one in particular was, in my opinion, more enjoyable for various different reasons. I started covering this tournament in 2017 in Gabon. And prior to that, there were some really contentious elections in Gabon, where there were even allegations of, dozens of people being killed during protests. And that sort of tension was drawn into the tournament. In 2019, that was when Egypt and President Sisi were sort of trying to come out of that isolated position that they were in. And he also was trying to, throw lots of big international events. But same thing, that human rights record that he had, it also felt a little bit uneasy, uncomfortable. And then in 2021 in Cameroon, of course, we have the Anglophone crisis in the southwestern part of the country, but also with COVID, same thing. Something about it felt, tense. But this tournament, I can honestly say from the bottom of my heart, from all the Ivorians that I spoke to, everyone was excited to have this tournament in their country, and you could feel it. It really was the biggest party on the continent, and that was very, very tangible. And just the last thing I would say is that I think that for a West African country, they were the perfect host, because anybody that knows Côte d'Ivoire knows that there are so many different communities neighboring countries that call Côte d'Ivoire home now, whether it's, Burkinabes, Malians, Senegalese, everybody was there. They've been living there for generations at times, and they really brought this tournament to life as well. So for me, I rank this tournament a 10 out of 10.
10. That is a strong start, Maher. Okay, cool. So that all sounds good. What about sort of in the stadiums, the atmosphere at the games? I think there was some talk that it was the security was really tight and it wasn't that easy to move around. Did that affect sort of the noise at the games or how sort of intense the matches felt?
Um, but what you always have to sort of calculate in your head is that the opening match and the final are always going to be
Mm.
hectic because usually the heads of states, not even just the host president, is usually there, and so there's an entire security apparatus that needs to be put in place, and that's always difficult. I remember in 2019. I was going through the journalist entrance into the stadium, and the security guard told me to open my backpack. I showed him that I just had my laptop and my charger, and he said, chargers are not allowed. And I said, well, what do you mean? How am I going to work what if my laptop dies? He said, sorry, we received instructions that chargers are not allowed. And I argued with him for about 90 minutes. And eventually I just walked past him, expecting to be tackled from behind. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But later I understood that in Arabic, charger is the same word as power bank. And I guess power banks were not allowed because of possible explosive. So always have to account for the fact that opening matches and finals are always difficult. But besides that, there was two significant problems with stadium security. Number one, many I would say, I don't know how you describe them, people were exploiting the ticketing system. They were buying online and then selling them on the black market for very, very high prices. And that happened throughout most of Côte d'Ivoire's matches in particular. And the second thing is that I saw a lot of especially North African supporters, but not just North African supporters, wanting to show solidarity, with the Palestinian cause, and they had a lot of flags and scarves confiscated at the stadium entrances as well. But other than that, I think turnout in general was good because of what I just spoke about before, that there were so many communities living in Côte d'Ivoire, and they all showed up to support, their hometown teams.
Yeah, thank. I want to come back to the to the point about flags getting confiscated and stuff, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. I want to come to you, Sean, really quickly and talk about the football a tiny bit, right? So I think in more recent times, our proxies for the health or the success of a country's national team or their football system is the number of players that they have playing abroad, right? And so you look at the players in Europe and say, oh, the Nigerian team is stacked because they have all these players playing in the Premier League and Spain or wherever. But I wonder if this AFCON kind of was a good argument for the other model that kind of emphasizes the homegrown nature of developing football. What would you say?
I mean, I agree. Just totally agree with you on that. But just a correction, by the way, I'm not the editor anymore. It's Will Shoki is the editor. Africa's a country. I'm the publisher. I think you're referring, of course, to South Africa's performance in the AFCON, which is South Africa went there with 23 out of the 26 players play in the local league in South Africa. What people don't say actually is that they all mostly play for the same club. And that club, Mamelodi Sundowns, as Maher will tell you, he's done a lot of pods about this. They are an incredible team. They dominate African football, and they've actually taken on North Africans, for club dominance in Africa. So definitely, the last AFCON, even I wrote articles about how the model was, how do you use the diaspora effectively? The relationship between those Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora, and how do we use that energy to help build the idea of the nation or sort of continental pride. I think what this is, as you rightly point out, what this AFCON did is just to like argue something different. And I want to make to one other quick point. The somebody also pointed out, like, say, everybody's focusing on the fact that it's South Africa with a local team from the PSL, which is a very strong league. But they also pointed out that if you look at goalkeepers, you'll notice that a number of the goalkeepers also play in South Africa. So whereas European teams are interested in, hiring or signing infield players, they're not so keen to sign Africans as goalkeepers. And South Africa did something else also. It proved as an incubator. I think there's an article about this on Africa as a country. It also helped provide like as an incubator for African goalkeepers. So the debate's going to rage. I mean, the same debate raged about the question of African coaches. That you have local coaches coaching the teams, not local but an African, somebody who's African. And the last one was Algeria. This time it is the coach from Côte d'Ivoire who came in late in the tournament. So yeah, this debate will rage.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, I don't think this is necessarily going to change how FAs approach sending their players or trying to develop them. But I think there was like a distinct style of play. There was a distinct harmony to the to the football of Bafana Bafana. I think it really was at least for me, I think a good commercial for that approach to doing football. Maher, let me come back to you and just talk. We're gonna stick with just on the field stuff right now. And so there were quite a few upsets. I think you usually find upsets in a few in AFCON. It's kind of the nature of the tournament, but this one, it felt like some pretty shocking ones, right? Equatorial Guinea beat the host, I think, by 4. Namibia and Mauritania qualified out their groups. Morocco lost to South Africa. These are all kind of important, right? And I think when this happens, there's usually two ways you can interpret it, right? Either this is evidence that the Giants are fading and their football is not sustainable and sort of the end of an era, or you could flip that and say this is evidence that the game is growing on the continent and sort of the floor of competition is raising. How would you interpret it?
Honestly, Tunde, I think it's probably a little bit of both. Let's talk about, the quote unquote smaller teams improving first. And I think that's happened at an infrastructure level, at an institutional level within the federations, and then also the quality of players been improving as well. And I think that has a lot to do with, quote unquote, smaller nations using sometimes the reach in the diaspora to sort of shore up quality differences. Teams like Cape Verde or Equatorial Guinea obviously could, profit from the diasporas in Portugal and Spain in particular. So from an infrastructure level, just modern football, the way it is now, it's not so difficult to receive funding from FIFA, for example. If you just go and you apply for these FIFA forward programs and you have any decent level of governance at the federation level, they'll come and they'll build sometimes stadiums for you. They'll build national technical centers, medical centers, and that's exactly what Mauritania did. Mauritania is like they are the golden boy for FIFA when they say, look how we help small countries develop. They always pull up Mauritania because within a span of 7-8 years, they've structured and organized their domestic league. They now have, 3 very organized divisions of football. They have a women's national team, which they didn't have about a decade ago. They have a national technical center and a medical center and so on and so forth. So teams like that now, I mean, like 10 years ago, them coming to an AFCON, again, they wouldn't have a technical center where they could prepare. They wouldn't have so many of these, the minimal status quo or the minimal bottom line, they didn't have it. And so when they would come up against any quote unquote bigger nation, I think it was much more of a difficult task than it is now, where teams have that minimum. And on top of that, I think, again, modern football, a lot of these smaller teams know how to set up and play organized football. Whereas I think it takes a level more of sophistication to go down and break down a low block in a team that's playing defensive. And I think probably the top African teams haven't really mastered that yet. And I think that comes down to probably, I'm not going to say poor coaching, but the coaching isn't up to the standard of the quality of player. Mohamed Salah is a world-class player. Sadio Mane is a world-class player. Riyad Mahrez is a world-class player. But we don't have world-class coaches on the African continent just yet. And I think that's probably a financial problem.
I mean, if I could just say something quickly,
Please.
I think it's and Maher, I know he's an evangelist for Rulani Mokwena from South Africa.
Yes.
So when he says like I know he's correct. There aren't world-class coaches in Africa, but I think Rulani Mokwena, Pitso Mosemani, for some reason,
Yes.
It sounds like I'm going to do a lot of South Africa love, but it just happens that the 2 most interesting coaches on the African continent are both South African. Like Pitso was with Al Ahly, then he went to, I think he was in Saudi more recently. Rulani Mokwena it's an incredibly technical coach. I mean, Maher can say more about this, but yeah. So I think there are, like his point again, CAF has put more money into football. FIFA's put more money into helping FAs set themselves up. Also, people are not paying enough attention to, say, East African football. Tanzania,
Yes.
just today I saw Tanzania has 2 clubs in the CAF Champions League quarterfinals, Simba and Young Africans. Nobody talks about their league has spent, there's been a lot more investment in East African football. There's better organization. The way that Simba advertises itself, the fan experience has changed. And so this idea that there is like the big countries and the small countries, I think it has to do with like, how is your FA organized? Nigeria is incredible. It's incredible talent, but its FA has been unable to organize, effectively. Just this week, they fired. Well, they didn't fire. It was the end of the coach's contract, and it turns out that coach had been paid for like a while, et cetera, and so on. So there's a little more than just it's big, small in terms of countries. As Maher said, is it about how you organize that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think it brings me to my next question I was going to ask you, which is more about sort of what goes wrong when things go wrong, right? So I think I think FIFA has gotten, and I think deservedly, right, a lot of heat over the
Agreed.
past
Yeah.
few years for how they're run and sort of the front room office and all the dealings behind the scenes. But I think, Maher, you bring up Mauritania, right? And this growth that has happened over the last few years. Could FIFA not point to that and say this is proof that our model works if you do it right? And so the problem is not with us. What would you say to that?
I mean, the model works is, I think, a little bit of a, I mean, that's a little bit of a strong affirmation. I think a counter argument would be, no, you guys have so much money, and all it took was just this little amount to do so much in a country like Mauritania. So much was needed to be done that sometimes you just need, a couple, $2, $3, $4, $5 million, and look at the improvement. It can be 100% or 200% increase in improvement. And that's what it is. I mean, the smaller teams, again, quote unquote, it's easier for them to improve than it is for the bigger teams to improve, because again, that comes down to, in my opinion, really coaching, and finding a really good coach is very, very difficult at the very highest level. Sean spoke about Rolani Mokwena. I am probably his #1 biggest fan. I think this is probably going to be the first African coach born and raised on the continent that will probably be coaching a European Champions League club one day. So they exist,
You really
but
think so?
I think so. Yeah, this guy is incredible. I've interviewed him for Al Jazeera one time, and that we spoke for, it was supposed to be just 15 to 20 minutes. Ended up speaking for an hour, and just the way he sees the game, I think, is very, very unique. I think right now he's a top 10 to 15 footballing mind in the world, not just on the continent. So he's just 37 years old. I think it's going to take time for him to get his dues. But I think even in competitions like the FIFA Club World Cup, if he remains at Sundowns next year, and Sundowns can get there, and I think he can turn a lot of heads there. So yeah, I was just going to say that it's easier for the smaller teams to improve. It just takes maybe, a little bit of money. For FIFA, $2 million is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. And for the bigger teams, it's a little more difficult to improve. So FIFA, yes, they could say our system is working, but I mean, it didn't take much for them to really, they're throwing out crumbs, and those crumbs are helping teams develop.
I think that's fair enough. It would kind of be selective choosing of evidence for that kind of defense. You also mentioned the style of play and sort of how you have these world-class players who should be able to express themselves at the world-class level, both with their clubs and with their national teams. But I wonder if AFCON counts as sort of a victory for pragmatic football, because I don't know if the most expressive and expansive teams were successful here. How do you explain the Senegals and the Moroccos in an AFCON context?
Um, yeah, I think football, it was in a, it's there are dominant trends. So between, I would say, like between 2008 and 2014, we had the sort of influence of Barcelona into the Spanish and German national teams. I think we saw that sort of attractive football. But I think heading into 2018 with France and Didier Deschamps, I think we started to see a more pragmatic sort of style of football be be implemented with great success. Even the Real Madrid teams that won those Champions Leagues, I think people would argue, weren't playing the best football, but they were so successful at the highest level. So I think, like, at some point, nowadays, I think pragmatism isn't on vogue. Usually, in tournament play, in competition play, especially in the knockout stages, you can get to that, you can advance if you don't concede a goal, even if you don't score one because of penalties. But if you concede one, you're very much at a chance, very much at you can absolutely be eliminated. So I think tournament play, especially like the African Cup of Nations, I think it can reward at times defensive teams. And just look at the Egyptian national team of the last 5, 6 years, just flying through the knockout stages on penalty shootouts. So I think that's not necessarily new at the Cup of Nations. Some people enjoy that style of football, but I think it would probably be accurate to say that the AFCON doesn't necessarily reward very attacking sides if they don't defend well.
Sean?
So Maher brought up Germany and Spain and the kind of dominance at a particular point. That was also, to go back to the original point about South Africa, they also played with players who primarily played for essentially two clubs. So, of course, that model got changed because gegenpressen and all kinds of other more defensive football, park the bus. So that started to dominate, more technical, less creative football. But I think another lesson from the dominance of Germany and Spain is this idea that what if you played with players who play in a particular local league? And I think another part of that argument is Egypt. When Egypt dominated African football, people forget Egypt was primarily fielding players from essentially like two or three clubs. Even Mohamed Salah, when he started playing football, he played for those. I think he played in Alexandria though. But there is he played for like the same set of clubs, and they were very successful. They've won the most AFCON. And I think that maybe that's one of the lessons from this AFCON for me was like if instead of going to find all these what seem to be technically very gifted players, but they never play together until they turn up. So now you got to figure it out at the tournament. What if you came with a group of players that play together mostly like all the time, not so technically gifted, then you actually could go far in the tournament.
And it has, sorry, Tunde, can I just jump in really quickly? It has to do with familiarity, right? I mean, prior to these tournaments are in the middle of the season, the AFCON is. And so 2021 in Cameroon, I think they had 3 or 4 days of preparation because of the COVID issues. Teams were able to hold on to their players. This time around, okay, they get 7 to 10 days, but how much can you really implement with the team? How much can you come together in 7 to 10 days? But the familiarity, I mean, Sean did really well to point out the South African team of this year, the Egyptian team of 2006 to 2010. Maybe we could even throw in Ghana from 2008 to 2015. They made so many semifinals, I believe 4 or 5 straight, and they weren't playing at the same team, but it was a generation of players that grew up together from the under 17 national team level. And so they were very familiar with one another as well. They knew how they wanted to play. That is definitely a big factor at the Cup of Nations.
Yeah, I think that did kind of bear itself out in this last tournament for sure. One last thing on the football, and then I want to talk about other things. Maher, let's do it, man. Let's do the official post-mortem. What happened with our North African teams this year? These are, I would say, a lot of the most recognizable names in African football are from these 3 countries, 4 countries, 3 countries, and didn't really fare well. What would you attribute that to?
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Published a podcast on it yesterday, actually, or yesterday. And the conventional wisdom, for those of us that follow African football, is that teams in the Maghreb in particular, so Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, they tend to struggle anywhere else on the continent that's not North Africa. And again, the conventional wisdom is it's because teams like Morocco and Algeria, they tend to build their teams from the diaspora, players that are born and raised in Europe that never sometimes played, just a handful of matches elsewhere on the continent, and they don't know how to adapt to that context. They don't know how to adapt to the meteorological conditions or the pitch conditions or whatever the case may be. I think that was probably a good argument in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s. I'm not sure how great of an argument it is now. Egypt is sort of seen in a different scope because Egypt, as Sean pointed out, most of their players are playing domestically, and as a result, they play in the Champions League, and they do have extensive experience playing all over the continent as well. So if you ask, like any African football fan, what happened, they're going to tell you, well, they played in West Africa. So that's what happened. I tried to look at it a little bit deeper than that. I think for Morocco and Algeria, the problem was coaching. I think they were too predictable. Morocco played the exact same tactical system, a 4-1-4-1 that they played at the 2022 World Cup. And I think South Africa knew that, and there was no plan B. And Moroccan supporters, that's what they really had a gripe with their coach Walid Regragui, is that there was no plan B, and he's sort of got to stay now until the next AFCON, which is going to be hosted in Morocco. However, he had to really change all of his staff. There's been a big reshuffle within the Moroccan national team at the coaching level. With Algeria, our coach got fired, and same thing. He's been playing the exact same 4-3-3, the exact same tactical system since he won the Cup of Nations in Egypt in 2019. And so the Mauritanian coach, listening to him speak after Mauritania upset Algeria, it was like mind-blowing because he was breaking down all of Algeria's tendencies and how Mauritania set up to sort of nullify them. And so at a certain point, as a coach, if you're not renewing your ideas and you're not renewing your players, other teams are going to be able to scout you and they're going to be able to counter what you're trying to do. So I think the problem for Morocco and Algeria was coaching. Tunisia is a bit deeper than that. Their federation president is in jail. There's not a lot of money in the country. They had to hire a local coach who was on $15,000 a month at the time. To compare, Algeria's coach was on 208,000 euros a month. So this is the Tunisia coach, never coached at any of the big clubs in Tunisia. He never, it's a nice salary, right? I don't know what the Africa Center is paying you, but
It is not that.
Yeah, so Tunisia, they were penny pinching, and even the quality of player, I think, is not as high as Morocco and Algeria. And I worry for Tunisia in the next year or two if they don't get their federation problems, fixed, and if they can't hire a good local domestic coach. And there are good Tunisian coaches out there. And then Egypt I've been told by my Egyptian friends, I'm sure you guys have colleagues from Egypt, same thing. The economic situation in Egypt at the moment is extremely dire. I was speaking to a friend of mine. He told me the price of cooking oil was rose by 200% in the last 3 weeks. They also had a very expensive coach. I think Egypt were a little bit unlucky. They go out to DR Congo on penalty kicks. But now I worry about them in the future because the federation doesn't have a lot of cash. They hire a local coach on $30,000, which is, again, not very high in African football. He's a local domestic coach who never proved anything. So they're going the Tunisia route. And I do wonder if they're going to have success in the future. So I think it's a little bit lazy to do a sweeping generalization and say North African football is in decline. I think Morocco and Algeria will be fine in the future. I do worry about Tunisia and Egypt.
I have a quick point on this, and
Please.
sort of a question to Maher. When you watch Tunisia play, it's very unimaginative. So just historically, like, and maybe if you could counter that argument, with Egypt, the complaint has always been there's Mohamed Salah, like you said, super talented, and if you the next day or next couple of days later, he's playing at Liverpool, and because he's playing with better players, you can see that he's one exceptional, world-class players. But in Egypt, he's sort of isolated at the front. He's sort of operating alone as a lone striker up front. And so that's probably why, and I agree with you probably about your prognosis about Morocco. I don't think there's much to worry about there. There's a lot of young talent coming through. I think they won the under-23 AFCON also. So they got an incredible generation coming through. With Algeria and Morocco's models, the proximity to Europe, the massive diaspora, which if the player doesn't get into France, or they even now make a choice, I don't even want to play for France or the Netherlands or Germany. So there's enough talent for those. They got a massive talent pool. I'm sort of, I don't know, this is sort of pop analysis, is that Egypt and Tunisia, the football is really unimaginative and predictable. And you're right, teams set up and they can just they defend the wall against them and beat them on the counter.
Yeah, I think it's pop analysis, but it's probably correct. The thing with Egypt is that they're gonna look back and say, well, yeah, we played a boring brand of football, but that got us to the 2017 final and they got us to the 2021 final. We would push teams to penalty shots, we would prepare penalty shots really, really well. And then we would sort of get through. Some people might say it's lucky. Some people say it's really good preparation. And This coach was brought on, Rui, the Portuguese coach, to sort of balance their play a little more. Because if we talked about Egypt of 2006 to 2010, that was very much more of an attacking style of Egyptian national team. It was very beautiful football that they were playing, and I think that's what Egyptians like at heart, you know. But he was sort of brought in to sort of balance the two, and his biggest criticism was that Egypt conceded 2 goals per game at the AFCON. And so they felt like Egypt left themselves too open behind. And so it's one of those things where I think they would like to play more attacking, but I think defensively, they can't justify playing the kind of football that Liverpool played, because they'll just get hit on the counterattacks. As for Tunisia, I think it's more of a cultural thing. This might be lazy pop analysis as well, but you know, Morocco, when you talk about cultural influence, it's probably Spain. You just look across the Mediterranean. Spain is just across, and then Algeria is probably France. That has a little bit of Spain and Italy, but Tunisia is Italy. And even the Tunisians, how they say the word goal is punto. It comes from point in Italian. That's so almost everything. And I think you could really see it, you know, the way they try to gain an extra minute and extra time, you know, like complaining to the referee, crowding around them, playing defensively. They're very, very pragmatic. I think it's just some cultural influence from their proximity to Italy. I think Lampedusa is what, maybe only 50, 100 kilometers from their shores. So
Yeah, it's really close.
That's really interesting. Even being in the proximity of Italy and you can't help but park the bus is kind of the analysis I'm getting here. Fair enough. Sean, I want to talk about a point that Maher made really quickly about sort of the situation in Egypt and how it's sort of a difficult economic situation. I think that would extend to quite a bit of the continent right now. And I wonder if you think it would be unfair to kind of to try to place hosting an AFCON in the context of these kind of challenging social situations back home. What would you say to the argument that it might not have been the most responsible thing or the most effective use of resources by the government to, like, I think the bill is close to like $1 billion is what they're saying. Is that unfair? I think the Ivorian economy is doing relatively well actually in comparison, but like a substantial part of the population does still live under the poverty line. Is this fair analysis?
I mean, I'm the last person to defend mega sports events, and as to whether they provide any kind of impetus economically to a country. Like, there's no evidence in the history of mega sports events that actually an economy like benefits from it. So that's if it's in pure numbers, it's a bad idea. And you know, and we can also debate, like as you said, is this the right thing for a government to do at a particular point? But if you just take the much of the benefit from these kind of sports events are symbolic. Like if you, I mean, I'm from South Africa, where, and I'll get to Côte d'Ivoire in a minute. Like I'm from South Africa, where if you look at post-apartheid South African history, you can tell that story through its sporting events: the 1995 Rugby World Cup, the 1996 African Cup of Nations, the recent Rugby World Cup victories, the women's winning the AFCON, and now the national team going to the semifinals. The way that it lifts, like the sort of the spirit of the nation, the way people attach a certain kind of weight to these events, I don't think you can disregard that. And I think in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, and I mean, Maher and other members of Africa's country, they went to Côte d'Ivoire, and so they, you know, they have much more to say about this. And it's too bad Fiifi's not here, because I know he's written about how Ghana doing so badly, how that affects the national mood in Ghana. And actually, one of the biggest protests, or sort of most significant protests in recent times, is one against the sports ministry and against the FA. So, but in Côte d'Ivoire's case, there's a lot of writing recently about how a cynical view is the president Ouattara. This is part of his re-election campaign, and so he wanted to be associated with the cup. I don't know if you saw, like at the end of the final, how he's like running over to dance with the team, and he's just kind of basking in this whole glory. And one argument about him is that he was the president when they've won the AFCON. So that's like his claim. So there's a certain kind of, there's symbolic value to these things that I think then plays a role in elections, plays a role in the national mood in the country. In a place like Côte d'Ivoire, where there's deep deep, not, well, it's deep, but it's also on the surface. There are these tensions that come from, there was a civil war. There are questions about not what does it mean to be Ivorian? And then if you have a national team that represents all the different kinds of people and it does well, then all those questions about like, what did it cost, takes a backseat.
I think that's super fair, and I think it's difficult to quantify the importance of those things that you mentioned, right? And but I think another part of me thinks, yeah, those things take a backseat until the bill comes due, right? And then if it's not this generation, the next one has to pay for it. But then again, I don't know. I'm sure this factors into the calculus, and the idea was still let's do it, because I know a lot of countries have turned down the opportunity to host. So I have to think that, you know, in their cost benefit analysis, this still made sense, and I'm willing to give benefit of the doubt that it was a responsible yes.
I mean, I just want to say one other quick thing, which is if you look at the history of the most recent AFCONs, you'll notice that they're generally hosted by very undemocratic governments. So it doesn't, like if a Kenya was, some other countries unable to host the cup because the infrastructure is not there, or CAF went on a visit and found that the stadiums are not up to scratch or haven't been built yet. So what will happen is at the last minute, Equatorial Guinea, Maher mentioned Gabon, will jump in. The South Africa, I think, jumped in 2013. I'm trying to remember who couldn't hold it, but so for me, that was an anomaly, because in general, what happens is you want to have a quick turnaround. You go to a government that doesn't require parliamentary approval for such expenditure, and so you host it in these very undemocratic places. The difference is with you've hosted it now in Côte d'Ivoire, which is nominally a democracy. I mean, not only some Ivorians will have an issue with this because Ouattara changed the constitution so he could like run some more, and there's an election coming on, and this is going to be how he's going to try to stay in power. But I think I just want to make that point that these kind of debates, which I think is a necessary debate, and as I was trying to say, like I would come out on the side that says is this your priority? But then I also understand that there is a particular kind of symbolic value that does, and from all the coverage that I've seen about Côte d'Ivoire, is that if Ivorians, both people at home, people in the diaspora, they agree that this thing has added to a certain kind of idea of the nation, a positive idea of the nation. Like it has contributed, maybe not in money terms, but it has contributed to how people think of themselves as being Ivorian.
And Maher, you were there in person. Were you able to get a sense of how being host was received by Ivorians?
Yeah,
That's kind of a sweeping thing to ask you, but were people opinionated?
I asked everybody from Airbnb hosts to taxi drivers to people I met on the street, people in restaurants. Mostly everybody was happy that the tournament was taking place in Côte d'Ivoire. One Ivorian did tell me that in 2012, when Côte d'Ivoire made the final against Zambia, I think there was, I'm not sure exactly, I need to brush up on my political history of Côte d'Ivoire, but I think there was a runoff between Bagbo and Ouattara at the time. And they were telling me that there was a case where half the population didn't want Côte d'Ivoire to win against Zambia because it would have meant a boost in popularity for the incumbent at the time. But they told me that's definitely not the case this time around. So one of the more insightful conversations I had was in 2021 with I have to keep his name off the record, but it was with somebody that was very, very high up in previous CAF administration, really number 2 or number 3. And what he told me was that there's a complete imbalance in the relationships between the Confederation of African Football and governments, because CAF understand, he said, and this was the intelligence and the intelligence of Issa Hayatou, the former CAF president. But CAF completely understands that they're 100% reliant on governments, because governments foot the bill for national teams. They foot the bill for, domestic leagues. These are not, like the Premier League is its own commercial entity, that makes its own money and it's self-sustaining. No, that's not the case in African football. CAF understands that for them to have an African Cup of Nations every 2 years and to bounce around from country to country, they're going to need governments to be willing to foot the bill. Because as Sean said, I think there's never been a Cup of Nations that's actually justified. It's from a cost expenditure. That's never. I don't think none of them have ever broken even or made a profit ever. Not even close. And so yeah, it's just as you mentioned. It's like it's hard to quantify these things, but how much do you put? How do you value Morocco becoming, this new darling of world football? And what does that mean for them as a country now? After they made it to the semifinal of a World Cup, and now they're hosting the Cup of Nations, and now they're going to be hosting the 2030 World Cup. That took a lot of investment from Morocco for the last 10 years, and so much lobbying behind the scenes. It was not profitable at all for the last 10, 15 years. But maybe after 2030, how are people going to perceive Morocco as a second nation to host a World Cup? All the tourists that are going to be coming there. It's complicated calculus, but something it's worth considering, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's definitely complicated. I think just the 1 billion number is just eye-watering to me. I can't help but think, what could $1 billion do? I think it was they built one, I don't know how many, they built one really fancy one for a bunch of money, and then I think they revamped a couple. And did they build any new ones, or was just the one?
Just I believe the one that's named after Ouattara himself. The
Sounds
other
about
ones I
right.
believe were renovated, but they're even like there's a lot. That 1 billion number also includes infrastructure. So there's this really modern bridge in Cocody, or that leads from I believe Plateau to Cocody. That's like it was actually part of the opening ceremony. They had this inflatable bridge, sort of a replica of the one that was built to show you like, look how we're investing in infrastructure. So yeah, it shows you like how much the 1 billion number is not, it's the roads. The roads were great compared to Cameroon in particular, but you can drive from Abidjan to Korhogo and the roads are really, really good. So the 1 billion number reflects more spending than it goes wider than the just the football itself.
And fair
But
enough.
yeah, it's still a huge number.
Yeah. I think, yeah, that's fair enough. I also, bridges stay useful even after football tournament. So yeah, it's hard to knock that. I think we lost Sean, but actually I can just my next question was for you anyway while we wait for him to get back. So it did get pretty political at a time. I know the DRC players in one of their knockoff games, they did stage a protest pre-match, and we did talk about it afterwards. But I wonder, and this is just purely in your opinion, do you think as a football tournament, AFCON, or even just African football in general, is doing enough for the issues that matter on the continent? I feel like there are more than enough things that you could highlight now. Are you of the mind that sort of time and a place, or do you think the players could be sort of bigger vehicles for the issues that matter back home? Because they really are, and a lot of the times, as famous as you get when they go home.
Yeah, I mean, for the Congo issue, the issue in East Congo between, the DRC and M23 and by proxy Rwanda, it's a tough one because I don't think CAF can step in and say anything and say we need to do more as, the governing body of African football, because essentially, it's a conflict between two states, via proxy sometimes, but it is a conflict between two states. And so Rwanda, with how much sports diplomacy they're doing, not just in football, but in basketball and other things, I don't think CAF would be willing to step in. And I'm not sure if it's their place to. That might be a little bit controversial. I do absolutely endorse and I do love players, expressing themselves if it comes from them, and I think players should do more of that. Absolutely. Um, and I don't want governing bodies to come down and sanction them, for expressly political demonstrations or expressly political acts. I do want players to have a voice. Um, but yeah, it's one of those where it's like you're on a thin line, because in every single, I mean, not, yeah, in pretty much every corner of Africa, we have little conflicts and skirmishes popping up. And so is CAP supposed to go out and make declarations every time in each conflict and say, yeah, this side is right and this side is wrong? It's controversial, but I'm not sure it's their place to do that. But I do absolutely endorse and respect and encourage, I think, players to use their voice if they have something to say.
If I could say something quickly,
Please.
one is if you just take, firstly, from the position of CAF, Patrice Motsepe, the president of CAF, who's South African, who, by the way, also happens, people forget he's like the brother-in-law of the South African president.
Is
And
he married to Ramaphosa's sister, or is Ramaphosa's how's it work?
They married to two sisters.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah, they married to two sisters. And he himself, he's like a very, wealthy businessman who kind of made money after he's sort of one of those beneficiaries of the end of apartheid, like the notion of black empowerment, where a number of black South Africans then sort of entered into those traditional bases of wealth, like minerals, mining, etc. But my quick point on him is like he's not known for making political pronouncements about everything. He can. I was talking to somebody on Twitter the other day, a Nigerian journalist, who complained about how he's trying to get a straight answer out of Patrice Motsepe, and I was like, "You're not going to." He has a great way of evading an answer and everything. So I don't expect anything political to come out of him at every one of these CAFs, whether it's held, particularly if it's held in an undemocratic space. He says nothing, and he'll praise whoever's the incumbent leader in the place. But just to get back to the players, I think it's interesting. I think there's a history, of course, of players having political views. African players, particularly in Europe, Konate, what is his name? Freddy Canute. Freddy Canute, who played in Spain for Mali, incredible footballer, had political viewpoints. More recently, it's very unusual. The protest by the Congolese players, I was surprised by that, because I think at the CAF, the one in Cameroon, the only political activity I saw watching it on television was, I think, I'm still trying to find that reference again. There was I think it was Moroccan fans who had protesting because of some kid who had gone missing in Morocco, and they wanted the police to pay attention to his case, but it just flashed on screen for a bit, and then they cut away from it. And that was the only notion or mention of politics in 2019. Sorry, in 2021. At this one, what was interesting was, as you say, the Congolese one, but the Congolese one was, again, they were talking about Rwanda, and they were not talking about the complicity of their own government in this particular thing. And then I think what's actually the one that's very interesting that I haven't seen much talked about is after the tournament, the case in Senegal where there was the election was postponed. What a lot of people missed was Kalidou Koulibaly. He went on Instagram and he put up the flag, and it was him in black and white, but the flag was in color. Then there was, I think, one or two other players who also posted something about the violence in Senegal. Curiously, Mani didn't say anything. This contrasted very interestingly for me strongly with when what's his name, who played for Everton. He's back at Everton now. He played for PSG. Idrissa Gueye, when he refused to wear socks for PSG that had rainbow flags on. This was during a game that was to honor or make reference to gay rights in France. A number of Senegalese players suddenly had courage and was putting stuff on Instagram, making statements, etc., talking about our culture, this culture, that culture, and somehow they don't have a voice. When I think at this point, because wrestlers, footballers are very popular in Senegal, and people assume that they would say something at this point. The last one on this is the South African team. There was actually something interesting with the South African team, and I've been trying to write about this. So one of the players, Grant Kakana, who's one of the defenders, his mother is a junior minister in the office of the president of South Africa. But he jokingly, in an interview, when they were asking him, what did he think of Ronwen Williams' performance as goalkeeper? And he said, "Oh, he was so great. I would like him to be the Minister of Finance," which is sort of like a pointed criticism about the sort of unhappiness that most people in South Africa have with the government of the ANC. And then the last one is when they got back to South Africa, they landed, they were at the airport, and Teboho Mokoena, who made it to the 11, the team of the tournament, along with Ronwen, he was standing there with the SAFA president, who's a former ANC member of parliament, was on, spent time in jail and so on, Danny Jordan. And then all the players were given the mic to thank the fans, and he grabbed the mic and he said something to the effect of, I want to acknowledge my president, my favorite president, Julius Malema, who's an opposition leader. So it is interesting. Not all the players are doing that kind of careful, I can't say this, I can't say that, I have to think what the president's saying. And I think for me, the takeaway really is there's a younger generation of footballers, I think, that are not gonna, and again here, maybe the Congolese one showed a little bit of that. I think Koulibaly's, kind of in his 30s now. But I like the energy of these younger footballers of South Africa who are very nonchalant. Now, you could argue that that's because South Africa is a very robust democratic society. And in South Africa, that's how people talk. You can say anything you want about the president of the country. You can say anything you want about public officials. So it's not unusual for a South African footballer to say that. But I was really encouraged and taken by the example of those footballers. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that was closer to my point, right? I think point taking about CAF or the various FAs, but I just meant more on the level of the individual players. I think of the 24 countries that were at AFCON, like 9 or 10 or 11 have elections this year, and like they're not all guaranteed to be going on, right? So I think it just felt like we're at a moment where there were more than enough things for players to come out and state their interest or care for it. And yeah, outside of Koulibaly, I don't know if I felt that I saw enough politics, which is kind of crazy because you're usually looking for people to stick to sports, but I think I was hoping slash expecting more. Was that unreasonable?
They mostly African players do things like footballers anywhere, which is to talk about their cars, to thank God. That's their kind of, and their family. I think that's their main. I mean, in that way, I don't want to put a burden on them. Oh, they should have this kind of special, thing that I don't want to put on other people in the society, and I think it's unfair. But I do think to your point, they're public figures, and in some societies where people don't often have other outlets to express themselves politically, people look to football players, these kind of public figures, to express for them. And there have been, I mean, one argument to make is it's very unusual, but there have been African footballers who've spoken out. Didier Drogba famously, as people remember, during that moment that Maher is referring to, this kind of previous tense moments, he saw the tension within the society around this idea of like who's Ivorian, Ivorite, and he kind of made a point of using the national team as this thing that can bring people together. He tried to run, I think, for president of these countries. Their national association didn't win because football is also about certain, entrenched figures that want to stick around forever. But yeah, I think Drogba, as a sort of the older previous generation, maybe, is one footballer who's tried to do some politics. But in general, it's very unusual to find African footballers. I don't know if Mar he might have a different view on this, but I think it's very unusual to find an African footballer who like speaks out on politics explicitly. I don't see that generally. Salah is the case where people really expected him to take a particular view in Egypt, but he's at the one hand, he's of course like anybody, he's very patriotic. So in defense of his country, well, it just happens that it's a military regime, so he's not gonna, and he has family who lives there, so you're not gonna be reckless. But at the same time, there's other people who read any little move of Salah. The opposition will read anything that Salah does that looks like it's different from the government. They'll see that as like, oh, Salah is with us. So it's very difficult, I think, as a footballer of that stature to make a some public commitment to any kind of politics.
Yeah, I'm at a place where I always think like this is my stance in general. Is footballers are not your heroes. Like they can be from on the pitch, but you shouldn't model yourself off the pitch. I think you're absolutely right, Sean. I think over the course, of African football history, which is now spans, let's say, since the independence movements of the 60s, 70, 80 years, there's very, very few cases of footballers going out and speaking against their own regimes, for to sort of espouse democratic values and so on and so forth. I remember speaking to a Nigerian journalist with a lot of experience about Nigeria and their golden generation in the middle of the 90s and them under the Sani Abacha regime. And he was saying, the uncomfortable truth is that many were cozying up to him because of the material advantages that sort of he would prefer upon them. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. Even before, Macky Sall, this controversy, when he initially threw Usman Sonko, the populist sort of opposition leader, in jail a couple of years ago. I think this was immediately after the 2021 AFCON in Cameroon, after they won the Cup of Nations, and their national team are absolutely heroes. And the disillusionment from the Senegalese public, for many, especially of his supporters, who wanted to see their players who became demigods overnight. They wanted to see their players speak up about that, especially in Senegal, as we mentioned. It's probably one of the more robust democracies in West Africa and on the continent. And again, they would do like these vague messages, like Sean said, like 3 hearts, one green, one yellow, one red. But there were only, I think, 1 or 2 players that actually spoke out about him throwing Sonko in jail. And they were not established players at all. They were not even the national team. They were just Senegalese players playing abroad. And so footballers are not they're not your political heroes. Maybe it's unfair for us to expect them, because in the end, they're just private citizens. Maybe people are not interested in politics. Maybe it's unfair on us to sort of project that on them. But over African footballing history, there's been very few cases of footballers actually going out and speaking out, especially against their own regimes.
I mean, even if they just complain about their own conditions as footballers within the national team. I mean, I think I saw recently a case where a footballer complained, I think it's in the 90s in Nigeria, when Sunday Olise was captain, there were bonuses being paid out. And he had said no, like they weren't given the bonus that they were promised. And I think a couple of the players spoke out, and some of them were never picked again. So it's like just the power imbalances within who plays for the national team and how that's linked to kind of certain political interests. So just speaking out about your conditions in the national team, that's just about the team. What if you're now going to go speak out about actual politics? I think if you're in a space in which there is where it's accepted that you can have political viewpoints, and that your viewpoint won't keep you out of the national team. I think that's probably what's happening in the case like South Africa, which I know more intimately. But I don't think it's harder in a situation where, and also the South African league, there's more money. The clubs have way more power than, say, the FA has. Like anybody who knows South African football knows that the chairman of Orlando Pirates, Irvin Khoza, the chairman of Kaizer Chiefs, Kaizer Motaung, and even when Motsepe was the owner of Sundowns, now I think his son runs it, they were way more powerful. Actually, right before AFCON started, the big issue was Mamelodi Sundowns didn't want to release the players even for the tournament. So that shows you like the imbalance. That's a much more kind of, I don't know, the word's not democratic, but the power is more dispersed in that national FA. So saying things, criticizing is much more normal, I think, than it might be in another situation where you rely more on foreign players who play in foreign leagues. There's not an active national league. I always thought that Algeria had like a very well organized national league, and I always thought that might influence like the nature of the national team. Algeria, Morocco, particularly the North African countries, Egypt, before they shut down football after 2011 and they started playing in these empty stadiums. But I always thought that Algeria, Morocco, there was a lot more that kind of robustness about the kind of, not political power, but just the power of footballers and clubs. But I don't know if that's the case. Maher might know better.
Yeah. All points really well taken. I would love to get see if anyone in the audience has questions. If you guys just want to throw them in the chat, I will shout them at the panelists. It's a shame Fiifi wasn't able to join us. I think he would have added a lot of color to this next question I was gonna ask. Maher, can I just this idea of So it's nothing new for when the tournament ends. Everyone is suddenly very reflective about sort of the state of football in their country and how these players are so pampered and they don't really care as much as when they play with their club teams. But I feel like this might be recency bias, but I feel like to a larger extent, I saw a lot more frustration being leveled at, yes, the players, but also like national footballing bodies at home and sort of FAs at home. And I would love a sense of like what is the accusation? Where is the rot, if any? I know for Ghana, for example, there are these accusations, and in Nigeria, that's perennial, right? So could you give a sense of what is going wrong with these FAs?
Yeah, absolutely right. There was a movement. Well, first of all, immediately after Ghana were eliminated, the journalists were absolutely enraged at the stadium. They blocked the team bus from actually leaving the stadium because the players refused to speak to the press. They just walked right by them in the mix zone. Um, and it's always interesting for me as like an Algerian or even like a Moroccan or an Egyptian journalist to see the power dynamics between the national press and the national teams. Because in North Africa, we have very little power dynamics. The players always walk past us. They don't say anything, and we can't do anything really. We don't have strong journalist unions or like they do in Ghana or Senegal. Senegal, man, they come with 120, 150 journalists. They're all wearing the same polo shirts. They're all sleeping in the same hotels. They are like a mini mafia without the negative connotation, but they run things kind of. And so it's always interesting seeing those power dynamics. But the Ghanaian journalists were absolutely enraged. And when they went home, they staged, this movement, hashtag Save Ghana Football. And you can look it up on X or Twitter or on other social media about um, all of a sudden so much information started to leak about what the budget was for the African Cup of Nations for the entire Ghanaian delegation. I believe it was around $8 million, which was a pretty inflated number. You don't really need that for 27 to 23 to 27 players
Sure
and
don't.
coaches. Yeah. So people are all of a sudden throwing accusations at why do we have such a big budget? Why are we flying out, X amount of supporters, um, and paying these supporters, sometimes per diems, paying, FA club presidents that have nothing to do with the national team coming out to the tournament as well. Because why? Because those club presidents will then, if the FA election happens next year, they're going to vote for, the FA president that flew them out to the AFCON. So really buying votes. And at the same time, the Ghanaian Black Queens, the women's national team, are still, in bonus rows and, asking for their money that's rightly owed to them for previous performances. So
Hmm.
it's really about, as you mentioned today, I mean, like if Ghana went on to win the tournament, none of this would be happening right now. But these are pressure cookers, and
Yeah.
when you continue to crank up the heat and if poor performances follow, these things can explode. Even Nigeria is a weird one because again, if you look at, I'm not talking about per capita, but in terms of the sheer size of the economy, it's an absolutely big one on the African continent. For, Again, these are discussions that I have behind the scenes. I haven't corroborated this information. This is not a scoop or anything, but from what I'm being told, like the Nigerian FA doesn't even pay their coach. It's a businessman that owns a club that actually pays the Portuguese coach Jose Peseiro on behalf of the Nigerian Federation because they don't have the money to pay him. It's like how you guys can't come up. I know it's like he's not on peanuts like the Tunisian coach was, but the
He's on 50.
Nigerian
He's on
national team,
50,000.
yeah,
He's
50,
on
yeah.
50,000 a month. Yeah. Well, he
Nigeria should
was.
be able to
Yeah.
cough that up.
Yeah.
Nigeria should be able to cough that up. So I don't know. It's one of those
Yeah.
where it's just bad governance, and that's automatically going to be the one thing that's pointed at after tournaments because the coach is going to go, and then when the coach is not there, who else is left to blame? You know,
Yeah,
I
it's
think I saw a
gonna,
stat. I saw a stat that since 2000, between 2000 and now, Nigeria has had 21 coaches. That's like almost a coach a year.
yeah. You could feel the
crazy.
team filled with subs of
Yeah.
coaches that we've had over the past couple of years. It's not great. I think there's all this talk about the promise of sort of like Africa and the future on the continent. And every time I hear these projections, I just think none of this is guaranteed. None of this is a given if like the underlying structures that are supposed to like facilitate all of this goodness happening are like rotten. And I think this just speaks to a lot of that, which is institutionally things have to change from the bottom up. Let me get to some questions really quickly. We have one from Cosmos, which is basically asking, thanks for the question, by the way, and thanks for joining. It's asking sort of based on AFCON and what we've seen, how do you see the prospects of African teams in the next World Cup? Are we winning?
Pele, didn't Pele
Yeah.
say something like by such and such a date, South Africa would win the World Cup? Sorry,
Sean, I've
Africa.
been
Gosh,
looking for this
that
exact
was a
quote to
Freudian.
see
It's a
exactly.
Freudian, whether he said it or not. That was a
Yeah, but I don't
Freudian
know if he
slip. I was
did.
like, South Africa
Yeah,
will win the
South
World Cup.
Africa.
An African team will win the World Cup. I mean, this is thing where like before a World Cup, you think, oh, the team that's in form are going to make it. I think the last World Cup, I thought, I didn't expect. This is funny. I actually thought, I really thought Ghana was going to do really well in the last World Cup. I mean, they were in good form. I didn't expect much from Cameroon. I mean, that was clearly shown. Morocco, the thing about Morocco, there are reasons why Morocco did so well, and this maybe this I think South Africa we benefited from it, but maybe this was a blip, and I expect Morocco to be fine again. They got great footballers. Like I said earlier, they have this under-23. If they qualify for the World Cup, there's like I think we have more places. What do we have? Like how many places do we have, Maher, for the US?
We have 9.5, 9
We
guaranteed
have nine and
places,
a
and then
yeah.
one team go.
And one playoff,
Exactly.
maybe against Uruguay or something. It's like or whoever, Australia. So there's more places. So it means that statistically we should have a better chance to get more teams into the knockout rounds, and hopefully maybe if we can get 2 teams into the semifinals, that for me would be brilliant. If we can get a team into the final, it would be incredible. But I can't tell you who right now looks like they could be the sort of flag bearer for African football. I wasn't convinced of Nigeria entirely in this tournament. They were solid, they were fine, but I don't think I can't I didn't watch that and be like, oh, Nigeria is gonna carry us to I don't know, the promised land. Côte d'Ivoire would carry us. I thought neither. I don't think South Africa will, but I didn't think either of those two are like the teams. I really love Kudus, the young Ghanaian footballer.
Player.
If Ghana can build a team around that guy, I think it could be special.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the one positive, I'll touch on it really quickly, is that there's not much that separates the top 10 teams in Africa, really. There's not a big difference, between. But look at the 5 teams that qualified for Qatar, and then look at the 5 teams that didn't. Côte d'Ivoire didn't make it, Algeria didn't make it, Egypt didn't make it. Those teams, Côte d'Ivoire are the champions now. So there's not very much that's separating them. So I don't think we'll see a diluted contingent of African nations at the next World Cup. And so you're sort of doubling up your chances, right? Instead of 3 teams in the knockout stages as we had in 2022, maybe we'll have 5 or 6. And then the more sort of the more lots you have in the, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but the more chances you have, the better.
Yeah,
the result you're gonna have. Yeah.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, I'm locking you both in for an all-African semifinals and Nigeria wins the whole thing.
Come on, I didn't say that last part. I did not say that last part.
That's what I heard. Okay,
if Nigeria wins the World Cup, I predict it's going to be an unbearable month of social media. I can't even tell forever. Like the rest of us will never hear the end of it. There were some people I think who were rooting against Nigeria. Tunde, you're laughing in AFCON because they couldn't. I think people couldn't deal with the Nigeria social media for the next week.
I think
I was surprised at how well South
month,
Africans took it.
Truly, though, I think 1 month is also being very conservative of you, but fair enough. We have a question from Raheem who's asking if AFCON could do, or CAF in general, could just do a better job of trying to connect with the very large African diaspora in North America and the US specifically. And there was a lot of buzz online, and I think there was a lot of chatter on Twitter, but I think it was very restricted to the continent and maybe some of Europe. But like, this is an incredible market for it. Do you think more could be done, or is that sort of we have greater concerns at the moment?
I mean, I watched it from So sorry, so go ahead, Maher. Go ahead.
Please go ahead, Shania. I'm good.
No, I was watching it from here. It was definitely not I'm in New York City, so if you're in particular neighborhoods like in Harlem, or if you're in parts of Brooklyn, there's definitely a West African restaurant usually that would show the games, particularly in the northern part of Manhattan. You could go to an Ivorian restaurant, and I've watched AFCON before at those sites. But in terms of social media, I think what should happen is, if you look in this tournament, for example, AFCON actually employed, I think, Kelechi, who you see on like Arsenal, AFTV. I think he was part of the social media team. And by the way, the AFCON, the CAF social media account, uh, Instagram, especially TikTok, was incredible. So it was funny. It was just good. They had a brilliant social media strategy. I think they have the European sort of diaspora kind of lockdown. You can put the sound off and do watch-alongs with various kind of, particularly the British diaspora, the large Nigerian, Ghanaian diasporas, and you can watch with them, watch games with them. So that was happening. I would love to see something like that emerge for this World Cup that's coming. Like literally, like the same kind of energy that you see with like Don Robbie, Colette, that kind of setting. Maher's five-a-side, I think, is definitely something that could do a lot if on social media and so on. So yeah, so I hope. I mean, I've seen that even the Premier League is now doing a series of programs with African Americans, interviewing players, interviewing fans, like doing a special program that you can watch on network television, on NBC, I think. So people just should produce content. The question of Raphael, I would just recommend just start making content. Just make the content, and if you make it, people will come. Yeah.
Yeah, I think social media, as Sean said, CAF does a good job. They outsource it to an Egyptian communications agency, and their name is Arqam. I've done work with them before. They're actually very, very competent, very good. Egypt is one of those places like Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, where social media is absolutely huge. And they do a really good job of even using, Pan-African teams. Now they start tweeting, if you pay attention, they'll start tweeting in, Swahili, they'll start tweeting in Lingala sometimes. They'll employ different people from all over the continent that have proven that they know how to use social media, and they'll sort of integrate them into their teams. I would like to see maybe, so from social media perspective, I have confidence that CAF and their teams are going to do a decent job, but I'd like to see maybe more of like physical events. Maybe why not host like a CAF African Super Cup in New York, or in I don't
Yeah.
know, and something like that, or in Boston. Why not? Maybe because like at the AFCON in
Or
Côte d'Ivoire, they brought,
friendly games. Friendly
yeah,
games. Yeah.
and make it a week and build up mini events around it. So bring on like maybe 5 or 6 African legends, introduce them to the US media, so on and so forth. I think that could be a good idea.
I think the US is playing Nigeria in LA sometime soon, when there's the next international break. If I'm a content maker, I would just build so much. I would be there. I would make a lot of content around the tournament, do like live streams, whatever. I think that's the way to do it. Yeah. So I totally agree with Mara about bringing playing, like they do this, what they do with in Qatar, where you play the African Super Cup, where you go play it in Qatar, go play the African
Absolutely.
Super Cup
Yeah.
in on the East Coast in the US, in Chicago, played in a city where there's a large African diaspora of different people are there, New York, etc. You don't have to do it in Meadowlands. You could do it in a smaller stadium, but you could fill the stadium. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some
I
business in there for someone.
Yeah, I think the Spanish football also did something. I think they played either some cup games or some league games in the Middle East, and that drew a huge crowd. There was some controversy around that too, but I know that was good for them too.
In Saudi Arabia, yeah, they play the Super Cup in Saudi Arabia. So there's the Serie A, the Coppa, one of the Italian cups, also gets played in Saudi now.
I think in 2013 or 14, the French Super Cup was played in Gabon. So to go bring it back to Central Africa. So.
Did not know that.
I didn't even know that. Wow, yeah.
Yeah. I have one more question, then I'll let you guys go. Sorry, but I just wanted to we can close on this one. It's a question from Raphael, who has a couple. I'll pick one because I think it's a really interesting one. We've talked a lot about the development of African players and sort of the growth over time, and his question is more about how we develop world-class coaches on the continent. I don't think there's this clearer pipeline for how you sort of develop as a coach and get to the levels. The really successful ones seem more like exceptions than the rule. And I wonder if you think what you think is missing in growing these kinds of coaches that I can then go on to do bigger and better things.
Yeah. First of all, there wasn't even a pathway that existed until 2018. So for those of you that aren't 100% familiar with this, to be a coach, a certified coach at a top club, for example, in Europe, or for, I think, most national teams now, you need at least what they call a pro license. So there's a UEFA pro license, Asian Football Confederation pro license, CONCACAF pro license. It's just, I think it's like a 3,000-hour course. You need to do like 1 year of actual practical work as a sort of intern at a club and so on and so forth. And then you get your badge or your license. CAF didn't have its version of the CAF pro license until 2018. And so for context, I believe UEFA's, I think it was in the early 2000s. I want to say CONCACAF in South America had one even earlier than that. And the other confederations, they signed memorandums of understanding where if you have your Asian Football Confederation pro license, it's valid in Europe. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I still don't believe the CAF pro license is valid all over the world. So getting that pilot version in 2018 out, and now the continuation of it and expanding it, that's really should be big for a lot of local coaches. And now it needs to be certified and make sure that, a CAF Pro license is worth its weight all over the world. The second thing is, I think we for way too long, we relied on, that old, European coaching carousel of names just going around from country to country, the white witch doctors, as people called them back in the day. The good thing is, I mean, there's a new blueprint now in that teams are going back to former internationals, young coaches. Usually it's their first or second job, and they're giving them the opportunity. So Mali's Eric Sekou, Guinea's Kaba Diawara, Senegal's Aliou Cissé, formerly Algeria's Djemal Belmadi. So many names now of African teams realizing that we can have just as much success, if not more success, with previous players. And a lot of them do have their coaching badges because many of them are dual nationals. All the names that I mentioned are dual nationals, and they played abroad and they had got their coaching badges abroad. So I think we're getting there slowly but surely, but we're not 100% there yet. And I would like to see more coaches born and raised on the continent, like Olani Mokwane from South Africa, that really show that themselves to be at a very top level. But I think he's probably quite a rare find because I think he's just a genius. So I don't think many people are like that.
I think if he heard even half of the things you had to say about him on this panel, he would pay you for promo. But I think you're probably right, to be fair. That's also feels like a good place to leave it. Guys, thank you so much again for doing this. I really appreciate it. The conversation was wide-ranging and very interesting. I have learned many a thing about where French Cup games were played in the 40s and the 60s now, which is information I'll cherish forever. Again, everyone else, thank you all for joining as well. I'm sure Sean and Maher won't mind putting their Twitter handles in the chat if you want to follow up on them and their work in the future. But again, guys, thank you so much. I had a great time.
Thanks for having us on, Tunde.
Yeah,
really
thank you very much.
appreciate it.
And thank you for the audience. There was a number of nice
Yes, for the
corrections
questions.
and things that I got wrong, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining. And you can go on our website to learn about future programs and follow our newsletter and all that good stuff. Have a good rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
See you.
See you
Good
guys.
evening.
Bye. Bye.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.